Number 8. Renault F-17. Perched on a cliff along the northern coast of Norway's mainland, a lonely, rusting tank overlooks the sea. So how did it get there? During the summer of 1942, the Germans built a coastal battery in the area. Known as Wiedersehen, it housed 5 155mm guns which had a range of almost 12 miles. The battery was initially manned by 140 soldiers. It grew steadily over the next 2 years. After Finland and Russia signed a ceasefire agreement in September 1944, the Germans began a large-scale withdrawal from the region. Known as Operation Nordlicht or Operation Northern Lights, the abrupt departure was extremely destructive. In accordance with the Nazi scorched earth policy, soldiers destroyed dwellings, roads, bridges, and other structures as they abandoned their positions. They made sure to leave nothing behind for the encroaching Red Army. One of the few remaining remnants of the German presence at Wiedersehen is the cliffside tank. It's a World War I-era French Renault FT-17 that the Germans captured and brought to the battery. The FT-17 was one of the most successful tanks during the First World War. It remained in use throughout World War II, but was superseded by advancing tank technology within the first few years of the conflict. When it was no longer useful for combat, the Germans reassigned their captured FT-17s for guard duty, which is the role it most likely served at Wiedersehen. Given its obsolete nature, it makes sense that the Germans saw no reason to destroy the tank or take it with them when they evacuated the battery. Number 7. Junkers Ju-88. On the island of Spitsbergen in Norway's remote Arctic Svalbard archipelago, a badly damaged World War II-era bomber rests in the middle of a vast field. The wreck has been there ever since its crew was forced to make an emergency landing more than 80 years ago. During the war, Allied shipping convoys delivered much-needed supplies to the Soviet Union via the Arctic Ocean. To stop these vital shipments from reaching the ports of Arkhangelsk and Murmansk, the Nazis frequently attacked these convoys. In September 1942, 40 Allied freighters and 50 escort ships left Scotland for the USSR as convoy PQ-18. As the vessels approached the Norwegian Arctic, the German Luftwaffe's 26th Bombardment Wing prepared for the convoy's arrival to the region. After receiving the order to attack, a 4-man crew took off in a Junkers Ju-88D dive bomber with the goal of bombing the Soviet merchant ship Amarty. The plane was heavily damaged during the fighting, forcing the crew to land in the field where it sits today. They managed to bring the plane to the ground without the landing gear and were lucky to walk away with only minor injuries. The crew spent the next 2 days waiting for help and hoping not to get eaten by polar bears. Finally, a German plane flying overhead dropped a note instructing the men to walk north and pick them up later that day. The abandoned aircraft was among the 37 Luftwaffe aircraft and 13 Allied merchant ships that were lost during the skirmish. Shortly after the crash, German soldiers recovered any useful parts from the wreck and left the rest behind. The twin-engine Junkers Ju-88 entered service in 1939 and was one of the most versatile seaplanes to serve in World War II. More than 15,000 units were built in dozens of variants by the end of the war. Of the remaining handful still in existence today, only 2 are complete. Number 6. Soviet missile carriers. During an ATV ride deep in the forest one winter day, Russian Instagrammer Oleg Surkon managed to navigate through an area that was usually an impassable swamp thanks to the cold weather, which made the ground hard enough to drive over. He didn't expect to see any signs of human activity, considering the difficulty of reaching the area, so he was surprised when he spotted some rusting barbed wire. Surkon followed its path and stumbled upon a pair of massive Soviet-era trucks. It was clear that the deteriorating 8x8 vehicles hadn't been used in a very long time. They had been stripped of parts, making it even more difficult to find any clues about their past or what they were used for. While investigating the cab of one of the trucks, Surkon found a lever that led him to suspect that the vehicle was a missile launcher. Further research revealed that it was actually a missile carrier that would have provided support to a launch vehicle. A trailer attached to one of the trucks would have functioned as a living space for troops. It had as many as 10 different rooms that were separated by a narrow corridor and had sliding doors. The living quarters had designated resting, cooking, and planning areas, along with a few small windows in the roof to allow at least some light in. The exact make and model of the vehicles are unknown. Like many other Soviet relics, they were likely abandoned in the early 90s after the Iron Curtain fell. A massive number of military vehicles were deserted during this time as military funding dried up, and priorities shifted towards resituating the former USSR's infrastructure. Number 5. NASA Command Vehicle. In 2022, A listing appeared on a U.S. government auction website for a 1989 Airstream Executive Air Coach that was being sold out of California. There was no minimum bid requirement, and at first glance, the vehicle looked like nothing more than an outdated RV that had been repurposed as a mobile office. Photos showed obvious signs of wear and tear, including torn upholstery and a dirty carpet. One could only imagine by looking at the pictures that entering the motorhome would probably feel like stepping straight back into the 1990s. A closer look at the listing showed that the vehicle was located at NASA's Armstrong Flight Research Center. The sale also came with some unusual conditions, including that the buyer was a U.S. citizen. Knowing that this requirement typically applies to the sale of old military vehicles, engineer and Twitter user McAllister Higgins dove down a rabbit hole to find out what the government had used the RV for. He realized that it bore an uncanny resemblance to a NASA command vehicle he spotted in a video clip from the 2009 landing of the Space Shuttle Discovery. Further digging turned up a photo of retired Space Shuttle landing and recovery site manager George Grimshaw sitting in a van with an interior identical to the one for sale. All signs pointed toward the vehicle for sale being the official convoy command vehicle for the Space Shuttle at the Armstrong facility. In a Twitter post, Higgins described the Discovery as the holy grail of government auctions. He thought about bidding on the retired command vehicle, but ultimately decided against doing so. It was sold to an unnamed high bidder for $21,000. Have you ever bought something at an auction? Tell us about it in the comments, and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 4. Akrotiri Car Graveyard. The population on the Mediterranean island nation of Cyprus has historically consisted of Greek and Turkish Cypriots. When the country gained independence from Britain in 1960, existing tensions between these two communities deepened. Greek Cypriots pushed for unity with Greece, which Turkish Cypriots opposed. The Greek military tried to achieve this objective by staging a coup on the island in 1974, and Turkey responded by invading the country. Unable to solve their differences any other way, the two ethnic groups separated from one another entirely. Turkish Cypriots fled to the northern part of the island, while Greek Cypriots relocated to the south. The United Nations implemented a buffer zone known as the Green Line, which continues to divide the country to this day. Amid the chaos, around 400 vehicles were left behind in and around the town of Limassol as Turkish Cypriots went north. When it became clear that Cyprus was unlikely to reunify anytime soon, the British military parked the vehicles in a lot at the Akrotiri Royal Air Force Base. They documented and photographed each car, bus, motorcycle, and a piece of farm equipment to make it easier to reunite them with their owners. But many of the vehicles remained unclaimed as recently as 2016, when the military posted the information online in a last-ditch effort to see if anyone wanted their long-lost vehicle back. By then, the vehicles had been baking in the hot sun for over 40 years. They weren't drivable, and many were completely rusted. But just in case anyone wanted to retrieve their car for sentimental purposes, the RAF gave them one final chance to do so before moving ahead with plans to scrap whatever was left. Number 3. T-90 Tank. While walking near the abandoned Beketovsky airfield in the Russian city of Volgograd in 2021, a man known only as Sergei discovered a fully operational T-90 tank sitting at the edge of a garbage dump. Naturally, locals wanted to know why a modern $4 million vehicle had been seemingly dumped like trash. Based on the T-72 Soviet tank, the T-90 was designed during the early 90s and is Russia's main battle tank. Multiple variants have been developed over the years, with the most recent version entering production in 2017. The T-90 is a modern vehicle, so it didn't make sense that someone had left one surrounded by broken furniture, discarded tires, and piles of food wrappers, beverage containers, and other garbage. According to local news outlet v1.ru, described the tank as being in a state of full combat readiness. It hadn't been vandalized, indicating that it had been abandoned very recently. The only thing missing was the T-90's 7.62 caliber machine gun, suggesting that the tank's operator had removed it or that someone had stolen it. Photos revealed dozens of daily ration boxes near the tank, indicating a recent military presence at the site. A military official told the press that the tank wasn't abandoned, but that it was awaiting instructions to evacuate after participating in a training exercise in the area. The spokesperson said that the tank had spent several weeks at the nearby airfield practicing for one of Russia's famous choreographed tank waltz processions, but he failed to explain why the T-90 had been left behind. especially in a garbage dump of all places, and at the mercy of anyone who might pass by and become tempted to vandalize it. Number 2. The Keybird. For more than 75 years, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress heavy bomber has sat on the surface of a frozen lake in northwestern Greenland. Famously known as the Keybird, the aircraft was built in 1945, in the years immediately following World War II. It served under the 46th Reconnaissance Squadron of the United States Army Air Forces, which was tasked with undertaking highly classified intelligence gathering missions against the Soviets. On February 27, 1947, the Keybird's 11-man crew took off from Ladd Field in Fairbanks, Alaska for a routine flight around the North Pole and back to the base. It was standard protocol to carry out these missions under radio silence to avoid detection by the Soviets. But during the tail end of the flight, the crew radioed for help. They had encountered a storm and were unable to make the visual observations needed to properly operate the plane's experimental compass. When the Keybird emerged from the clouds, it was far off course. The crew was unable to get their bearings, and by the time military personnel pinpointed the plane's location, its fuel supply was running perilously low. Left with no other choice, the crew executed an emergency landing on territory they didn't recognize. Luckily, nobody was injured, and damage to the plane was minimal. It was at least 50 degrees below zero on the ground. Luckily, the crew had plenty of cold weather gear and managed to fire up the plane's auxiliary generator. They were rescued 3 days later. A team of aircraft restorers attempted to restore the Keybird to flying condition at the landing site during the mid-90s, but a catastrophic fire shut the operation down. All that remain of the wreck today are the charred and mangled remnants left behind by the blaze. Number 1. Mysterious wrecked seaplane. While deer hunting in a remote hilly forest in northern New Jersey during the early 2000s, an outdoorsman discovered a wrecked aircraft in a small clearing among the trees. It was in pieces and had clearly been sitting there for a long time. As a resident of the area for over 40 years, the man was shocked that he had no previous knowledge of the wreck. He was even more surprised when he discovered that many locals also had no idea that it existed. The hunter contacted Weird New Jersey for help identifying the jet. A reader responded to the appeal for information with a letter explaining that the aircraft crashed in 1967. After receiving reports about the remote wreck, police found it by following the smell of smoke and looking for sheared treetops. The area surrounding the plane was on fire, and the pilot was sitting on its wing in a dazed and confused state. 30 feet away, sitting against a tree, was the pilot's friend. Luckily, neither of the men had life-threatening injuries. They revealed that the aircraft went down during a routine training mission, but the exact cause of the crash remains unclear to this day. The military removed the engine, but left the rest of the downed plane at the site. By the time the hunter found the wreck, its make and model were indistinguishable due to its condition. Through an old photo, it was identified as a Marine Lockheed Martin T-2V Sea Star. Around 150 of the aircraft were built starting in the 1950s, and they were retired in the 70s. Only a handful of surviving examples are known to still exist, and only one of them is airworthy, making the rediscovered wreck exceptionally rare, even if it's unrecognizable. Thanks for watching! Which one of these abandoned vehicles would you be most excited by if you found it? Tell us in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time! Bye!